Thank you, Amy. So excited to be in Perth. So yes, I'm Richard Campbell. I've made a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? Oh my goodness, wow. Thanks so much for listening. My friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002 before the word podcast existed. That's why we call it the Internet Audio Talk Show. Once a week, we weren't clever enough to come up with a name like podcast. That's too clever for us. So once a week, we talk to a luminary somewhere in the industry. And then I also run as radio because I decided I wasn't making enough podcasts. So back in 2007, when Vista just shipped, I thought it was a good time to make an IT podcast. And so we just published episode 900 on Wednesday. Thanks. And thanks very much. And for a brief interval, when we weren't sure if .NET rocked, we made another show called The Tablet Show. And then we figured out that .NET did rock, and we rolled it back into .NET Rocks. So that's why there's 3 shows up there. And in 2011, the last space shuttle landed, and I went on a rant of everything that was wrong with the space shuttle, and my friend Carl said, you should record that. And that was sort of the first space geek out we ever made. And then I made a bunch more, and you may have listened to some of them, but this particular talk comes from, there's 100, catch up. In 2017, I published a show about building bases on the moon. It was based on a European Space Agency paper where they were talking about, hey, technology is advanced now, it might be practical for us to build a small base, the south pole of the moon, much like Antarctica, it would be periodically manned. And isn't that cool? So I recorded this show, put it out there as usual, people liked it, and then I got a call from NASA, which is pretty cool. I mean, actually, I got an email from NASA, and I didn't believe it, so I deleted it. They emailed again. It was nasa.gov. I mean, it looked really real. So I finally get the guy on the phone. His name is Chuck from NASA. And he says, hey, we really like your podcast. I'm like, well, thanks. It's like, yeah, we're kind of interested in building bases on the moon. I know. Would you consider doing a presentation? Now look, Chuck doesn't know me. He knows I make podcasts. So he's like, yeah, Chuck, I could do a presentation, sure. And he goes, do you like PowerPoint? We like PowerPoint at NASA. I'm like, yeah, Chuck, I know PowerPoint. I'm okay with PowerPoint, that's fine. He goes, well, that's great, we'd cover your expenses, but if you like to come and present on building bases on the moon. I'm like, okay, to who? Well, to us. You're NASA, right? Yeah. It's your stuff. Yeah. So you want me to present your stuff to you? Yeah. All right. So a few months later, I got to go down to the NASA Ames Research Center, which is just south of San Francisco, and I did a presentation on building bases on the moon to NASA. My mother is proud. I mean, look, it's pretty cool to be a presenter. Like, make no mistakes. Like, it's really fun to do shows like this and to be involved in things and so forth. But when you're driving into a NASA lab and the front gate screen has your name on it, this is a good day. And I could tell lots of stories about just doing this presentation, especially because there was like guys who flew stuff to the moon there. Real engineers. And yeah, it was an amazing experience. And so after I had that experience, conferences asked me, hey, well, you did that talk for NASA, would you do it for us? And I'm like, all right. I'm hardly an expert on space, right? Like, there's people who do this stuff for a living. I'm just a storyteller. I'm a pretty experienced storyteller, but still. But this talk has now evolved into just keeping up with what's going on right now. Like, it is a very exciting time to be in space. So I can't go back to the beginning, but let's start in like 2010. Anyone recognize this rocket? It's a funny looking one, because if you've been paying attention to space, rockets don't look like this. This is the original Falcon 9. It only flew like 3 times before Elon kept making changes to it. And look, I'm not a big Elon fan. He's got a little weird lately. I don't know if you've noticed. I kind of like the guy who flew his sports car to space. That seemed like a fun guy. But the whole, buying social media things and getting right-wing conspiracy, not much fun. Here's what's important about this mission, this very first Falcon 9 mission. It was a commercial mission. It was a test resupply mission to the space station. So NASA's gotten to a place now where they're trying to do fixed cost projects. So they're basically saying, we will pay this much per ton to the space station. How you get there? Up to you. I'd suggest a rocket. And so The point being that they have a high incentive now to reduce the cost over time so they make more money, right? This is the same thing that happened with aeronautics. The original aircraft, largely built for military, were not particularly efficient or effective, but eventually the US government set up an airmail service. And they said, we will pay for mail delivered at a certain rate, it was about 2 days, at a certain price, figure out how to do it, suggest an airplane. And that began a commercialization of it. So this, going back now 13 years, is efforts to start to commercialize space. Now the Falcon 9's evolved. This rocket seems small because it is. If we line up the original Falcon 1 beside the later stage models, you can see it got a lot bigger. And those were all optimizations to increase its capability, including the ability to land the first stage, which is insane. In fact, if you want to look at some really cool software, you go watch some of the videos they've made about the software involved in landing a rocket on its tail on a barge in the ocean. But they've done it more than 200 times now. SpaceX just did their 70th flight this year. 10 years ago, there wasn't 70 flights in the year for anybody. They now lifted more stuff into space this year than the rest of the world combined. Now, they're only about 20 tons per flight on a Block 5, but it adds up. Now, it's helping that they're flying all the Starlink satellites because it lets them press against the edges of what the rocket's capable of. But it's in a very evolved rocket now, and it's not the only thing it's doing. They're not just bringing payloads up for cargo, they're also bringing passengers. So in 2011, when Atlantis landed for the last time, which is how I got into doing these geek outs in the first place, America gave up its ability to fly people into space. They had to pay heavily for seats on Russian Soyuz. This vehicle, the Crew Dragon, restored their ability to fly people to space, very inexpensively, by the way. A 4-seat Crew Dragon flight's about $100 million, so save up. And you can buy them if you want. There's a few billionaires going around doing that right now. The Americans are, because they're trying to do the commercial thing, they don't want to be dependent on just one company. So they do have another vehicle in development. It's supposed to already be flying. It's called Starliner, and it's built by Lockheed Martin, and it has failed a lot. The original test flight was supposed to be 7 years ago. They actually did their first test flight 2 years ago. It didn't make it to the station. It did make it into orbit, but a lot of software problems actually crippled it. They brought it back down, decided they had to do that over again. And it's not like software. You don't just get to reboot it and try again. They had to build another one. And then it got to the pad that had even more problems. And now they're talking about possibly the first functional operational flight in 2025. So SpaceX has gotten pretty good at rapidly iterating on spacecraft, but lots of other people haven't. This particular craft is supposed to fly on an Atlas V. Now, Atlas V is developed by United Launch Alliance. It's another American company based a combination of Boeing and Lockheed Martin. They were the ones who maintained the space shuttle. This particular rocket was developed in the 1990s. It first flew in 2002. And at this point, it's flown 100 times and it's being retired. And I would point out that you saw the first Falcon 9 flying in 2010, and 13 years later, they've flown it 240 times. So they're moving much, much faster than the rest. And this rocket's going to be retired for an updated version of it called Vulcan. Now that's a diagram for a reason. We've never seen a complete version of this rocket. It hasn't actually flown yet, but they do have a prototype running, and this is the first version of it. That's the first stage of a Vulcan. It's on the test stand. It should fly by the end of this year. They've delayed it several times. And their very first flight, they're going to fly stuff to the moon. The folks at Astrobotics have this little lander they call Peregrine. And yeah, it's got a DHL logo on it. So that's, if you're wondering where your package is. And these little landers don't last long. The Indian government recently put one down on the moon successfully. Congratulations to them, 4th country ever to do it. Sorry about your slide into fascism, but do what you can do. And they don't last long. As soon as it's night on the moon, it's about negative 280, and that's a little hard on the hardware. Unless you've got some good heaters, you don't last. A key to that particular rocket, the Vulcan rocket, is actually built by Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origin. And this is the engine they call BE-4. It's very similar to the Raptor engine that SpaceX made, and it runs on liquid methane and liquid oxygen. The other rockets I was just talking about, the Atlas V and Falcon 9, they both run on a combination of high-test kerosene, called RP1, and liquid oxygen. The liquid methane has become a very hip fuel because it can actually pack a lot of punch, but it also behaves a lot like liquid oxygen, so in some ways it's easier to handle. When you put essentially a version of gasoline into a rocket engine, it's not bad for the initial launch, but it has problems when it gets into space. And as they want to use these over and over again and for longer times, it's better to switch the fuels up. But it's hard to use methane too. We're still learning a lot about it. We've been making RP1 engines for several decades. A lot of these engines have exploded, including the second flight set. So the very first flight set they've now put on Vulcan, and it's supposed to fly any day now. They're now building the second flight set for the second Vulcan flight, and one of the engines during test, which is just supposed to be a checklist item, throttle it up, throttle it down, thanks for playing, blew to pieces. Problem. Good thing is it happened on the ground. This engine's also supposed to go into Blue Origin's new rocket, a rocket called New Glenn. And again, I have an artwork there for a reason. Nobody's seen one. Apparently there's some bits being built in some warehouses, and occasionally we get a picture once in a while, but unlike Elon's approach to making rockets, where we get to see everything, these guys are being really secretive. But apparently they've won a contract to fly a payload in 2025, and we've yet to see one. I'm hoping for you, like I'd like to see another rocket fly, but it seems unlikely. That's not the only big rocket out there. You may have seen this one. This is SLS, the Space Launch System. This is a very odd rocket. This is the one that they're flying to the moon. They've flown it exactly once. And it did lift a Orion capsule, which is supposed to be a manned capsule, although there's not been anybody went in one yet, to the moon. They did some interesting orbits around the moon, and then they brought it back again. It looks a lot like Space Shuttle. It has that big orange tank. And the reason is that it's based on Space Shuttle components. Now, this has been a proposal since Shuttle was shut down, even before Shuttle was shut down. The idea being, hey, a Space Shuttle weighs about 100 tons. What if we used all the stuff that flies the Space Shuttle without flying a Space Shuttle? Maybe we could lift 100 tons into orbit, which is kind of what you need if you want to fly stuff to the moon. But the real problem here is that that big orange tank is mostly filled with liquid hydrogen. The Space Shuttle, to make it reusable, used liquid hydrogen as a fuel because it burns very cleanly and is very efficient. And so they were planning on using the motors over and over again, these engines they call the RS-25s. And they were very reusable. It's just that liquid hydrogen is a very low density fuel. So when you're building your tank set for your rocket, you have an oxygen tank, what they call an oxidizer tank, and you have a fuel tank. Now, if you're using RP1, your RP1 tank is going to be about half the size of your liquid oxygen tank, because RP1 is a very dense fuel. Now, if you're looking at using liquid methane, like they're doing for the New Glenn and also for Starship, which we'll talk about in a minute, and for Vulcan, it's about the same size. It's 1-to-1, almost exactly. But if you're using liquid hydrogen, the hydrogen tank is 4 times the size of the liquid oxygen tank. That's why that tank is so massive. They're using liquid hydrogen on their initial launch stage. It's pretty inefficient. So why are they doing it? Well, have you ever taken a look at American politics? So here's the thing about Space Shuttle and why it persisted as long as it did, is that United Launch Alliance managed to get some component of Space Shuttle built in every state in the United States. All 50 states contributed to Space Shuttle. It's a defensive tactic so that you can't cancel Space Shuttle because you'll be losing jobs in each state, so all the politicians keep voting for it. And then it started killing astronauts, and that became a problem. So they did end the shuttle program. They said, we're going to keep everybody employed because you're going to build a new rocket using Space Shuttle components. But they only funded it just enough to keep everybody employed, which is why it's taken so long to build this particular rocket. And the Governmental Accountability Office, the GAO in the US, just recently published a report where they said, this is a ridiculously expensive rocket. You can buy a Falcon 9 Crew Dragon for you and 3 of your friends for about $100 million. One flight of this rocket is $4 billion. That's an expensive rocket, even for Americans. And this is the small version of this rocket. They're going to make new models. They want to expand the upper stage to increase payload and more functionality around the moon. So those are not going to get cheaper. But they're still working on it. The question is, are they going to continue? Because there is a possible replacement. And if you've been paying attention to space, you know about it. It's Starship and their heavy booster. So this is Elon's dream of a fully reusable rocket. And you'll notice it's very shiny. And that's because it's made of stainless steel, which is very Flash Gordon, but it's also an appreciation that stainless steel responds well to very cold temperatures, to cryogenic temperatures. And this is a methane and liquid oxygen rocket as well, with 33 engines on the bottom. And this is actually a photograph of Booster 8 just before they did their very first test flight, which they did on April 20th. Because apparently Elon is that kind of child that he would fly a rocket on 4/20. And if you watched it, it flew for about 3.5 minutes. Now again, it's a test vehicle. This is okay. This is the way Elon does things. Fly off, and in fact, he had several other rockets ready to go, except 3 of the engines didn't light on the initial takeoff. They shouldn't have launched at that point. What it did was it slowed the liftoff down so much, they spent a long time lifting from the pad. And more engines failed as it flew. At one point, about 9 or 10 of them are out. And what was happening was actually the hydraulic control systems had caught fire, and they couldn't actually control the nozzles on the engines anymore. And so it started to tumble out of control. They detonated the self-destruct system, and because it's made of stainless steel, it did not self-destruct. Well, it did eventually, but it took over a minute. So for a while there, we saw where the explosions had blown holes in the side of the tanks, and they were leaking, but the thing held together and did like 3 full rotations, and then went its separate ways with vigor. And that was the end of the first Starship launch. And that's fine. They have another booster. They have another rocket. This is going to be great. What they didn't have was a pad anymore. That very slow climb out doubled the amount of time that those engines were blasting full bore. They blew through the concrete, and they blew concrete dust for kilometers in all directions. They also set fire to the landscape and burned at several hundred acres in the process. So the FAA has opinions about this, apparently. But more saliently, this was the only pad. And you can't reboot a pad. So they had to rebuild it. And they have, in record time, in just a few months. This is a test run of Booster 9 against the new pad with a water deluge system. So now there's a giant sprinkler head built into the bottom of that pad that blasts water up the same time that the engines blast down. And so hopefully the pad won't vaporize. The FAA, which is the authority in the US for whether or not you're allowed to fly a rocket, has now signed off on the corrections that SpaceX has made. But Fish and Wildlife has some things to say about setting fire to the countryside and firing concrete boulders into the ocean and all over the park. And so they've said between 30 and 135 days review. Elon is upset. Nobody seems to care. He'd like to fly by the end of October. I hope he does, because this is an extraordinary rocket. It's way bigger than you realize. It's 9 meters in diameter, all the way up. The concept being that that first stage will burn for about 2.5 to 3 minutes, separate from the upper stage, and then turn around and fly back and land, ready to be refueled and reused. Which sounds insane, except for that part where you know he's already done it 200 times. The upper stage then continues on into orbit with its 9-meter wide payload fairing, the largest thing that's ever flown into space. The James Webb Space Telescope, which is a phenomenal story all about its time, we could do an hour on that alone, had to be folded up to fit inside the 5.5-meter payload fairing of the Ariane 5. Unfolded, it's almost 7 meters across, which means it would fit unfolded inside of a Starship. But I'm wrong, 2 would fit. It's really big. And it's supposed to be 100% reusable. That upper stage now will do its work in space and then deorbit and land on its tail. Refuel it, restack it, fly again, if it works. So here's the only numbers in this whole story. This is the breakdown of the cost per kilo to low Earth orbit. So I showed you the Atlas V, which is a rocket from the late 90s, been flown 100 times. In the 90s, it was almost 20,000 a kilo to low Earth orbit, but then SpaceX came along and lowered the prices. Now it's about $8,000, which is not bad. Falcon 9, the current cheapest flight into space, generally speaking, at around $3,000 to $3,500 US dollars per kilo. So get on the scale. Losing weight's never had a higher incentive. The Falcon Heavy actually is a lower price per pound or price per kilo, but it's got some other complications, so we only do certain things with it. The SLS now holding the record for the most expensive system going. There is one that was more expensive, Shuttle. Shuttle all up, when they wound down the program with the 135 flights that they did, came in at about 65,000 US dollars per kilo. Vulcan, the lower three here are all fiction, because none of them have flown. Well, not usefully anyway. Vulcan, they say they'll be about 9,000. I'll believe that when I see it. New Glenn, really fiction. I don't know. We'll see. And then the question mark, what will Super Heavy cost per kilo if you got the whole vehicle back, right? Like an aircraft. Like, this is Elon's old line. If I flew a 747 to Australia and then threw it away, how much would an airline ticket be? If we could fully reuse the rocket, some folks are saying as low as $7 a kilo. Maybe $1,000 a kilo is even reasonable. But, you know, somewhere in that number, now you're talking about regular people doing a trip of a lifetime kind of thing. Like, you're getting into new levels of thinking, but also what you can move into space in that kind of scope. That's the state of rocketry as it stands right now. Let's talk a bit about the moon. This is my favorite picture of the moon. Why? Well, there's always a question you should ask whenever you see a picture of space. With the technology we have today, people can make a lot of stuff up. So the question you should ask is, who took this picture? Because that's a tricky spot. That is the far side of the moon. Notice it's not the dark side of the moon. There is no dark side. It's just the far side of the moon. The moon is tidally locked to the Earth, so the same face of the moon always shows to us down here, and this is the other side. Who took this picture? There's a satellite called Discover. It's actually a solar observation satellite. It observes the moon, so it sits in a Lagrange point, L1, between the sun and the Earth. This is a gravitational balance point, and it's about 1.5 million kilometers away from the Earth. But at that point, the tug of the Earth and the tug of the sun are about the same, so it'll just sit there. And so it always has a full view of the sun, and if you look directly behind it, it always has a full view of the Earth. And some clever person was smart enough to put a telescope, and it is a telescope that's 1.5 million kilometers away, looking back at the Earth, because it always has a full frame picture of the Earth, and it routinely takes photographs of the Earth, and you can download them if you'd like. And every so often, the moon whizzes through the frame, and I mean whizzes through the frame, because things are moving, right? We don't understand how quickly everything in our solar system actually moves around. And one of the proofs that this is a real photograph is the errors on it. So the camera on Discover is not a color camera. What it actually has is a single black and white camera, and it has different filters. And so to take a full color picture, they actually have to take 4 photographs. And the 4th photograph is green. And so if you look really close, you might see on the edge of the moon there's a green haze. That's because the moon moved before they took that 4th photo. And they could actually see the little bleed. So it's not, perfect resolution, but it's a cool picture. Why are we talking about the moon? Well, everybody's talking about the moon right now. Now, the Americans have already been to the moon. That was the Apollo missions. This is back when they were convinced that they were better than the Soviet Union. They showed it off by building big rockets. And 12 men walked on the moon. 11 of them were test pilots. One of them was a geologist, the guy in the bottom right-hand corner, Jack Schmitt, the only scientist to walk on the moon. What's the difference between a scientist and a test pilot? When you ask any of the other 11, what were you thinking about while you were on the moon, they all say the same thing. God, I hope I don't screw up. Because they're test pilots, and test pilots follow the script exactly. They're trying not to screw things up. Jack is a scientist, and he was looking at rocks that nobody else had ever looked at before. He didn't care if he screwed anything up. In fact, Jack was so keen to look at rocks, he fell down a lot. That's Jack on the moon. You'll notice he's a bit dirty. He liked looking at rocks. He's a geologist. And so he got a little too close to his rocks sometime. See his helmet? On the side of the helmet there's these little squares. See that? So on your left arm in the Apollo walking suit, there's a checklist of all the steps you're supposed to do on each day. And Jack really liked looking at rocks. And so he kept lifting his gold visor up to get a better look at the rocks, because the gold visor was changing the color of the rocks. Now that gold visor is there for a reason. Sunlight coming down on him has no filter. It'll take your eyes out instantly if you look at it. But Jack really wanted to look at the rocks. And so he kept lifting up his visor. In fact, the only picture we have of Apollo astronauts on the moon where you can see a face is Jack. Because he's lifting up his visor because he wants to look at the rocks. And so he started stuffing bits of paper on the side of his helmet so he could lift his visor without going blind. Humans are designed to explore. Humans are designed to analyze an environment. We're incredibly good at it. And when you give someone trained in how rocks work a chance to look at rocks nobody else looks at, he will jeopardize his life to do it. And he did. He also found some of the most important rocks, because science isn't done by, eureka, I found it. Science is done by, what the hell is that? Jack knew what rocks should look like, so he found the rocks that shouldn't be there. He found an unshocked piece of olivine on the moon. Now, if you're into rocks, you're like, whoa. Olivine is only formed in volcanic compression. So that olivine was made inside the moon. Now, there's another way to make olivine. It's by hitting something very hard, like an asteroid plowing into the moon. So there's lots of shocked olivine on the moon. But Jack found the unshocked olivine that proved that not only was there volcanic activity on the moon, but that it actually erupted, and that those eruptions sprayed that rock onto the surface, and he found one. Geologist doing his thing. So, what was the problem with the Apollo missions? It was this thing, the Lunar Excursion Module. It is much too small, it is much too fragile, and it will kill people. And it very nearly did several times. The Americans took a huge chance continuing the Apollo missions. They were just much too dangerous. And so they had to stop. They cut back the missions. They'd done their job. The real goal here was to prove they were better at the Soviet Union. They pulled it off. I mean, you can talk about the ramifications of that. But we're going back. This is the Artemis missions, which, by the way, Australia has signed on to. And we have our first Artemis mission now. Artemis 1 flew already. That was that very first SLS flight. And we are getting close to flying our second Artemis mission, Artemis 2. And there's going to be a Canadian on board, so we're all pretty proud. They are not going to land on the moon. They're just going to go into orbit, and then they're going to come back. They're on a free return trajectory. It's a test flight for the life support system. It's a huge step forward. Artemis 3 is when we're actually supposed to land on the moon. Now, this is still playing with the near rectilinear orbit. They want to put a space station around the moon, which is also very cool. There's been delays on that, and it's not actually essential. But the real challenging thing they've done is they've chosen for their lunar lander, which is the hard part here, SpaceX's Starship. Now, it's a modified version. It has boosters around the upper part of it to help with the landing. Because if you use the main engines, you'd be blowing big holes in the moon, just like you did to your pad. But it's also 60 meters tall. There's a little people down there. Like, watch that first step. I know the moon's got less gravity, but it'll still kill you if you give it time. So they're going to need an elevator. It's an interesting design to make all of this work. But that is the current pacing item, is to get that lunar lander done. So if you're thinking Starship was just one of Elon's interesting experiments, it's also a key part of the equation. In order to make that lunar lander work, they're going to need a bunch of Starships because they need to refuel it. We have never refueled a vehicle in space, ever. We don't know how. We're going to have to learn how, which is why it's kind of the pacing item. There's another proposed lunar lander. This is the one going to be done by Blue Origin. It's now gotten some funding. Notice it's much shorter. The people are at the bottom. Good feature. Fuel tanks at the top, but it's liquid hydrogen, and it's very difficult to store liquid hydrogen. So they're going to have some challenges too. But we were talking about refueling, because that one's going to need to be refueled as well. I don't know, there's something cute about this. Two of them flying real close together. See, the problem is the fuel moves around when you're not actually accelerating. Like, here's an example. This is the inside of a SpaceX fuel tank. You can tell the moment that the thrust stops. All the fuel's at the bottom, thrust just stopped. And the fuel goes for a walk. So you need to keep the fuel down at the bottom of the tank if you actually want to be able to pump it out. So you have to be accelerating the entire time. There's a bunch of ways to do that. On many engines, actually, they have a thing called an ullage thruster, where they'll just give a little bit of push to move the fuel down before they light the thing off. We're not sure if it's going to be going end to end like that, but that is definitely part of the equation. And I'm just going to wrap up now. We're at the limited time. The place they want to put that base is on the moon, on the South Pole. This is the Shackleton crater, right on the South Pole of the moon. Ask the question, who took this picture? This is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which, by the way, was built and flown by those guys at Ames. I met this guy. They composited this over a period of months by flying directly over the Shackleton crater with the satellite and taking a photograph and put it together. What's important about the Shackleton crater, because it's directly over the South Pole, there are parts of the rim of the crater that are always in sunlight. And the interior of the crater never gets lit, and it is filled with water ice. And that changes everything. Now we have a resource on the moon that we could actually use. And that brings us to the landers. Now you may have seen recently India put their lander down on the South Pole. First time anyone's ever landed on the South Pole. And the Australian mission is also a South Pole mission. It is a lander in 2026, specifically to go get the ice. So there's a sensor on it, a neutron reflector that's going to, as they run over the surface, they're going to look for the reflections, show water ice. It's got a small drill to drill in to see if they can actually grind up the ice. I don't know if it's going to be a solid or if it's going to be crystals, and then pull it inside the vehicle, heat it up, and see if they can separate off water. And by the way, you have until October 20th to enter the contest to name this thing. Right? I don't know, Rover McRoverface, come up with something. That's all the time I've got. I hope this was fun for you. I just want you to be really excited what's going on right now. We're all involved in this, and space is going to be a real thing more than ever before, and Australia is going to be part of it. Thanks for your time.